The quiet in a house does not fall all at once. It settles slowly, gathering like dust accumulating on the surfaces of a room that no one bothers to enter anymore. I am 81 years old, and for the vast majority of my existence, my days were defined by the constant demanding noise of being useful to the people I loved. I live in a quiet, leafy suburb just outside Manchester, where the grey slate roofs crowd together and the rain often makes the pavement shine like polished stone. My hands, which now tremble slightly when I pour a cup of morning tea or attempt to fasten the small buttons of my cardigan, spent decades scrubbing kitchen floors, mending torn school trousers, and nursing my late husband through the agonizing, drawn-out years of his final illness. When he passed away, the modest terraced house we had shared felt terribly large and suffocatingly silent, echoing with memories of a life I could no longer share with anyone. My son Peter and his wife Helen came to me during those early days of mourning, with gentle smiles and practical solutions, insisting that I should not be left alone. They invited me to pack up my life and move in with them in their spacious modern home, promising safety, warmth, and the joyful, bustling company of my growing grandchildren. I accepted their offer with a heart full of weary gratitude, genuinely believing that the deep bonds of family would be my sanctuary in old age. In the spirit of that trust, I readily agreed when Peter sat me down one evening and suggested we streamline our finances to make everything easier and safer for everyone involved. I brought my state pension, my carefully guarded life savings, and the monthly rental income from a small terraced house I had inherited from my late sister, placing it all into a joint account that Peter would manage on my behalf. I thought I was simply contributing my fair share to the household, ensuring I would never be a financial burden to the boy I had raised with such devotion. For a little while, the arrangement felt perfectly natural, a comforting extension of the care and provision I had always offered my family. But gradually, imperceptibly, my physical and emotional footprint within their beautiful home began to shrink. The space I occupied was quietly and systematically reclaimed, piece by piece, until I felt like a fading ghost haunting the edges of their busy, polished lives. If you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The changes began with the physical objects that anchored me to my past and gave me a sense of comfort. I had a favourite armchair, a slightly faded floral piece that I had deliberately placed by the large living room window, so I could sit in the natural light, read my books, and watch the seasons change in their manicured garden. One afternoon, I returned from a short walk to the local shops to find my chair had been banished to the dark, draughty corner of the upstairs guest bedroom. In its place stood a sleek, minimalist wooden desk that Helen said was absolutely necessary for the children's homework, though I rarely saw them use it. A few weeks later, I opened the kitchen cupboards to set the table for dinner, and found that my beloved floral china set, the one I had received as a wedding gift and cherished for half a century, was entirely missing. When I asked Helen about it, she offered a tight, sympathetic smile and explained that she had boxed it all up and put it in the loft because it was simply too delicate for daily use, replacing it with heavy, modern square plates that felt cold, heavy, and completely unfamiliar in my hands. It was not just the physical displacement of my belongings. The very rhythm of the household began to flow around me, as if I were an inanimate stone in a fast-moving river. When Friday evenings arrived and they decided to order takeaway food as a treat, the delivery driver would simply appear at the front door. No one ever thought to ask me what I might like to eat, or if I had a preference for the evening. A plastic container of something excessively spicy or overly rich would be placed in front of me with the unspoken assumption that I would simply eat whatever was provided without complaint. More painful than the forgotten meals was the sudden, oppressive silence that would fall over the kitchen whenever I shuffled into the room to make myself a hot drink. I would hear the lively, animated chatter of Peter and Helen discussing their day, but the exact moment my slippers crossed the threshold, the conversation would abruptly halt. They would exchange quick, significant glances, and then Helen would loudly ask me if I was feeling tired, effectively shutting down any chance of me participating in the life of the house. My son Peter, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged and whose nightmares I had chased away in the dark, began treating me like a fragile, slightly confused dependent who could not be trusted with the details of reality. When we went to the local bank branch together to sign routine paperwork for the joint account, he would step in front of me and speak directly to the tellers, completely ignoring my presence. He would answer questions explicitly addressed to me, speaking over my head in a low, serious voice, as if I lacked the mental capacity to comprehend the transactions happening with my own money. If we bumped into distant relatives or old neighbours at the supermarket, Peter would instinctively take charge of the interaction. He would give them a cheerful, sanitised summary of my declining health, explaining how well they were looking after me, while I stood silently beside him, reduced to a mute prop in his public performance of filial piety. Whenever I tried to gently assert myself or express a mild frustration about being left out, Helen was always right there to soften the dismissal. She would pat my arm, smile her practiced, overly patient smile, and tell me not to worry my head about such complicated adult things, making me feel utterly childish for being hurt by their exclusion. The deepest, most profound wound manifested itself around the large oak dining table in their open-plan kitchen. For decades of my life, the Sunday roast was my absolute domain. I was the one who roasted the potatoes to the perfect golden crispness, the one who sat proudly at the head of the table, serving generous portions and guiding the loud, joyous family conversations. But in Peter and Helen's house, the geography of the table had shifted entirely. I was permanently assigned to the furthest corner, completely removed from the centre of gravity and the flow of discussion. I would sit there, mostly silent, mechanically cutting my food, while the family eagerly debated upcoming holidays, car upgrades, and expensive home renovations. I listened to them make grand, sweeping decisions about their comfortable lifestyle, acutely aware that many of these luxuries were being quietly and continuously subsidized by the steady stream of my pension and my rental income. I was funding the very table where I was no longer allowed a voice. Tell me honestly, have you ever felt something like this inside your own home? The illusion of our happy, functional arrangement finally shattered on a rainy Sunday afternoon. We were all gathered around the dining table, finishing the remains of a rather dry roast chicken that Helen had prepared. Peter leaned back in his chair, swirling the red wine in his expensive crystal glass, and confidently announced his latest financial master plan. His eldest daughter, my university-aged granddaughter, was looking to move into a very expensive flat in London, and Peter declared to the table that he was going to arrange a substantial new loan to cover her hefty deposit and her first 6 months of rent. He spoke with the casual, breezy authority of a man who believed he had infinite resources at his disposal. I sat in my corner, my hands resting quietly in my lap, feeling a sudden, sharp spike of genuine anxiety. I knew, because I still possessed a sharp memory and a basic understanding of mathematics, that their monthly outgoings were already alarmingly high. I knew that the joint account, heavily padded by my money, was frequently dipping into its overdraft limits just to cover their current unsustainable lifestyle. I did not want to cause a scene, nor did I want to embarrass my son in front of his wife and children. I simply wanted to protect the family from a financial strain that I knew could eventually ruin them. I cleared my throat, the sound incredibly loud and disruptive in the sudden lull of the family's conversation. I looked directly at Peter and gently, very carefully, suggested that perhaps it might be wise to wait just a few months before taking on such a massive burden. I murmured that it might be prudent to first look closely at the credit card debts that were already being paid from our joint account before signing a new financial commitment. It was a reasonable, measured piece of advice from a woman who had successfully managed household budgets through recessions, strikes, and long periods of hardship. Peter stopped swirling his wine immediately. His face instantly darkened, flushing with an ugly, mottled mixture of deep embarrassment and sudden, raw irritation. He hated being reminded of his actual financial reality, and he clearly hated even more being questioned by the woman he had relegated to the shadows of his home. He slammed his glass down on the table, the dark wine splashing over the rim and staining the pristine white cloth. He glared at me, his eyes hard and completely devoid of any familial affection, and he cut me off loudly in front of everyone. "Your opinion doesn't matter anymore, Dad," he snapped, his voice dripping with heavy condescension and dismissive anger. The room went entirely, breathlessly still. The sheer cruelty of openly telling me my opinion did not matter was a heavy, breathless blow. But it was the very last word of his sentence that truly broke my heart into irreparable pieces. Dad. In his haste to shut me down, in his blind, flustered irritation at being challenged by an elder, his subconscious had slipped in the most revealing way possible. He had confused me with my late husband, the man who used to handle the major financial decisions for our family decades ago. It was the ultimate, devastating erasure. My identity, my very existence as his mother Margaret, had become so utterly irrelevant to him that I was just a generic, outdated figure of authority that he needed to swat away like a nuisance. I had become an old household habit, a piece of faded wallpaper that nobody bothered to look at properly anymore. I waited in the heavy silence for the correction. I waited for him to blink, to suddenly realize the dreadful slip of the tongue and the harshness of his tone, to reach out and apologize to me. I looked at Helen across the table, expecting her to at least offer a placating gesture or a mild rebuke to her husband for his disrespect. I looked at my grandchildren, hoping to see a flicker of sympathy or shock in their young eyes. But absolutely no one corrected him. No one gasped, no one defended me, and no one offered an apology. Helen simply reached out with a sigh, wiped the spilled wine with a paper napkin, and seamlessly changed the subject to the terrible weather forecast for the upcoming week. The children immediately went back to scrolling on their glowing phone screens. I was completely alone at a table surrounded by my own blood. I did not cry at the table, nor did I storm out of the room. I quietly excused myself, claiming a slight headache, and slowly climbed the carpeted stairs to my bedroom. The house grew quiet later that night, the children asleep and the television murmuring softly downstairs in the living room. I left my bedroom door slightly ajar to let in the warmth from the hallway radiator. As I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I heard Peter and Helen moving about on the landing. Helen was speaking in a hushed, pragmatic whisper. She was telling Peter not to worry about my little outburst at dinner, assuring him that they would just get the new rental agreement for my terraced house drawn up by the solicitors by next Wednesday. She said they only needed me to sign the paperwork so they could secure the higher rent, and then they would have plenty of cash flow to keep everything moving. Her voice held no malice, only the cold, mechanical calculation of a business manager assessing an asset. I sat up in my bed, the darkness wrapping around me like a thick, heavy blanket. I reached over to my bedside table and picked up my late husband's heavy gold pocket watch, feeling its familiar, comforting weight in my palm. Next to it lay the little blue notebook where for 40 years I had meticulously recorded every single household expense, every penny saved for Peter's winter school shoes, every sacrifice made to keep our family afloat during the lean years. Holding those physical objects, the painful, undeniable truth finally crystallized in my mind with perfect clarity. I had surrendered my financial independence out of a deep, unconditional love, hoping it would buy me closeness, security, and care in my final years. But my boundless kindness and my silent compliance had been fatally mistaken for surrender. They did not see a mother to cherish. They saw a signature to forge and a revenue stream to manage. There was no dramatic weeping, no screaming, and no frantic packing of bags in the middle of the night. True heartbreak does not always announce itself with a spectacular storm. Sometimes it arrives with a profound, unshakable stillness. Something deep within my chest, a lifetime of constantly bending over backwards to accommodate everyone else's needs and shrinking myself to avoid conflict, simply snapped into a rigid, unbreakable line. I realized that if I stayed in this house, continuing to diminish my own existence to fit into their convenient narrative, I would emotionally perish long before my physical body gave out. I absolutely refused to let my final years on this earth be a testament to my own silent erasure. The very next morning, I rose early, dressing with meticulous care in a smart tweed skirt and my warmest woolen cardigan. I waited patiently by my window until Peter and Helen had left for their respective offices, watching their cars pull out of the driveway before I finally put on my coat. I walked slowly down the street and knocked on the door of Mrs. Higgins, an old neighbour from my generation who still understood the inherent value of loyalty and discretion. Without prying into my bruised pride or asking unnecessary questions, she agreed to drive me to the high street in her small car. We went straight to the local branch of my bank, where a wonderfully patient clerk, a woman who still remembered my first name from years ago, invited me into a private, quiet office. I sat across the polished desk, my back perfectly straight, and calmly dismantled the financial prison I had mistakenly helped to build. I instructed the clerk to immediately close the joint account that Peter had controlled with such unchecked arrogance. I carefully filled out the required forms to permanently redirect my state pension and the monthly rental income from my sister's terraced house into a brand new sole account entirely under my own name. With a few decisive strokes of a pen, I completely cancelled Peter's administrative authority, legally revoking his power to make any decisions whatsoever regarding my money. I watched the clerk shred the old mandates, feeling a strange, incredibly light sensation in my shoulders, as if I had just set down a terrible, heavy burden I had been carrying for years. Leaving the bank, I did not return to my son's imposing house. I asked Mrs. Higgins to drive me directly to the local housing association office in the centre of town. I explained my situation clearly to the housing officer, presenting my newly secured financial independence as proof of my capability. Within a few hours, thanks to a sudden, fortunate vacancy, I had signed the paperwork and secured the keys to a modest, ground-floor sheltered flat. It was not grand or luxurious by any stretch of the imagination, but it was absolutely perfect for my needs. It was located just off the high street, practically next door to the public library I loved, a short walk from the reliable chemist, and right across from the church hall where the community groups met, where people still looked me in the eye and called me Margaret. It was a place where I existed as a person, not a resource. I went back to the large house in the suburbs mid-afternoon to begin packing my things. It was exactly 4 o'clock when the heavy front door swung open and Peter burst into the hallway, his face completely pale and his breathing ragged and uneven. The bank's automated notification system had clearly alerted him to the sudden, catastrophic lack of funds in the joint account. Helen was right behind him, her usually perfect, unflappable composure entirely shattered. When they found me in the guest bedroom, calmly folding my cardigans and placing them into a suitcase, their carefully maintained veneer of polite control broke into 1,000 jagged pieces. Peter began to pace the room, his voice rising in pitch as he swung wildly between anger and sheer panic. He spoke loudly of betrayal, accusing me of going behind his back and deliberately trying to ruin him and his family. He demanded to know how he was supposed to pay the direct debits that were due on Friday, how he was going to fund his daughter's flat deposit, and what on earth the extended family would think when they found out I was moving into a sheltered flat like some abandoned pauper. Helen stood in the doorway, wringing her hands, talking rapidly about family duty, obligation, and how impossible things would become for them without my steady income to balance their overly ambitious books. I did not raise my voice to match theirs, nor did I let their panic infect my newfound peace. I simply stopped folding my clothes, turned to face them, and looked my son directly in the eye. I answered him quietly, but with a firmness that left absolutely no room for debate or manipulation. I told him that I was not abandoning my family, nor was I acting out of spite or malice. I explained that I was simply refusing to disappear any longer inside the dark, comfortable convenience they had created for themselves at my expense. I told Peter that he was a grown man who needed to learn to live within his own means, and that I was a living, breathing woman who deserved to spend her final years in a place where her voice actually mattered. I turned back to my suitcase, and they were left standing in the silence of their own making. The consequences of my departure arrived in their lives without any grand spectacle or dramatic shouting matches in the street. I moved out the following morning in a pre-booked taxi. I took only what truly belonged to me: my clothes, 2 sturdy suitcases, the boxed-up floral china that Helen had hidden away in the loft, and the fine linen tablecloth that I had painstakingly saved and preserved for special Sunday lunches. I left them the large, quiet house and the harsh, unforgiving reality of their own finances. Peter was immediately forced to contact his creditors and awkwardly renegotiate his loan payments without my money to buffer his pride. Helen had to finally sit down at the kitchen table and face the household budget with brutal honesty. And my grandchildren, stripped of the invisible financial padding that had funded their comforts, slowly began to realize just how much of their easy lifestyle had rested squarely on the shoulders of a grandmother they had entirely stopped seeing. It took several weeks before Peter found the courage to come and see me in my new home. He arrived at my sheltered flat on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, looking distinctly uneasy and somehow much smaller than I remembered him. He stood awkwardly in my small, bright living room, holding a cheap bunch of supermarket flowers, unsure of where to place himself. He accepted the cup of tea I offered him, clearing his throat nervously before finally asking me, with a newfound hesitant respect, what I actually wanted to do about the new rental agreement for the terraced house. He was no longer telling me what to sign. He was genuinely asking for my instruction. I poured the hot tea into my beloved floral china cups, the ones that were supposedly too delicate for his house, but fit perfectly in mine. I sat down upright in my own comfortable armchair, positioned exactly where I wanted it, right by my own window, where the afternoon sun streamed in and warmed my face. I looked at the son I had loved and protected for half a century, and I gave him my answer, calmly and clearly. I had not become a hard, bitter, or vengeful woman. I held no hatred in my heart. I had simply and finally recovered the absolute dignity of being more than a pension contribution, significantly more than a convenient signature on a legal document, and infinitely more than a woman who was expected to keep pouring out love while being quietly and systematically erased from the world. Tell me, when people stop seeing your worth, how do you remember who you are?